As we're coming to the end of the semester, it's time to take a broader look at the world we live in. In this lecture, we'll examine what anthropology and other social sciences have taught us about the modern world system. The modern world system, sometimes also called the global community, is the current international, economic, political, and cultural relationships that integrate almost every community on Earth into a single global-scale system. It brings together almost all of humanity into a single supercultural group, such that every nation is interrelated with and dependent on others. This is facilitated by the spread of modern communications technology, but it is much more directly the result of the spread of economic strategies from the West to the rest of the world. Before we look closely at those historical processes, let's first talk about the system as it exists today. The primary body of theory that anthropologists use to understand the world system is called, appropriately enough, world systems theory. This is a body of theories that holds that a discernible social system, based on wealth and power differentials, transcends individual countries. In fact, as the result of the capitalist world economy, there are three different kinds of countries. Core countries have the greatest wealth and power. Their role in the world system is primarily as leaders and consumers. They import raw materials from other countries, transform those materials into finished products, then export those products to other core countries for sale. Most of the innovation of new products originates here, and most wealth, that is, valuable goods, concentrates in the core. Some of the core's finished products also flow to the other non-core countries in exchange for raw materials. And with these wealth items, so do the core's cultural traits also flow. Periphery countries are the poorest and least powerful countries in the world system. They primarily export raw materials to core countries and import finished products from the core. Raw materials here is conceived broadly. These can be natural resources like metals or timber, agricultural resources like food or livestock, or even human labor. Periphery countries are sometimes called developing countries. Because they don't have the capital to develop their own resources, they're dependent on the manufacturing capabilities of the core countries. In between the core and the periphery is the semi-periphery. Semi-periphery countries serve as peripheries to the core and as core to the periphery. They have some manufacturing and production capabilities, which they use to produce goods for sale in the periphery countries. But they also import finished goods from the core. Likewise, they also import raw materials from the periphery and export their own raw materials to the core. Semi-periphery countries are also sometimes called developing nations, but they're more developed than the periphery. Today, the core countries in the world system include the United States, Europe, Australia, Canada, Japan, and several other economic powerhouses. Semi-periphery countries include much of the old Soviet Union, China, Brazil, Mexico, and India. The periphery is made up of the rest of the world, much of sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America, the South Pacific. But the world system, like any cultural system, is not static, and countries move from one position to another. In the 19th century, the U.S. was at best semi-periphery, and we only became a core nation in the early 20th century. In the 20th century, Russia was a core nation, exporting to the Soviet communist sphere. Following the collapse of communism, it slipped down the scale of power and wealth. And of course, China's economic growth in the last few decades is such that it will soon be a core country. So how did this system become established? Well, for most of the Middle Ages, trade was relatively uncommon throughout most of Europe. Travel was hard, expensive, and dangerous. Most goods were made and used locally. But beginning in the 15th century, trade began to expand as new transportation technologies, especially larger, more reliable ocean-going vessels, became more available. These big ships made it easier, cheaper, and safer to transport goods long distances. The wealthy and powerful began to realize that there was money to be made in trade. This led to an expansion of Europe's economy and the spread of a capitalist mode of production. While capitalism is defined today as having to do primarily with mechanized factories, it also involves the production of large amounts of goods with the intent of selling them for profit, and it was this aspect of capitalism that developed at the time. This economic strategy required a few things to work. First, you must have capital, wealth that can be invested to produce a profit. Today, capital is mostly in the form of machines and factories. In the 15th century, it was land and ships, both of which Europe had plenty of. Second, you need labor to produce the goods for sale, another thing that Europe had in no short supply. Third, you must have raw materials to produce the goods, and fourth, you must have someone to sell them to. Both of these were lacking in Europe. Being so densely populated, Europe had already depleted many of its resources, and that had resulted in a relatively poor, deprived populace. The wealthy capitalists needed to find resources and a marketplace in order to make any money. Europeans' search for raw materials and consumers drove the Age of Discovery, a period of exploration where Europeans went in search of resources and markets, and ultimately colonialism. As Europeans sought new sources of raw materials and new places to sell their products, the Portuguese and Spanish, who had the most developed trading navies, began exploring the Atlantic. Portuguese explorers went mostly southward along the west coast of Africa, and the Spanish, of course, funded the expedition of Christopher Columbus, who opened up the Western Hemisphere for exploration. The Columbian Exchange is the term used for the sudden explosion of ideas, resources, and products that flowed between Europe and the Americas following Columbus's discovery. It proved to Europeans that elsewhere in the world there existed huge reserves of resources and huge populations to sell to. The thing is, European cultures had never really done this sort of thing before, and they were not entirely sure how to deal with non-European societies in any sustained manner. The closest that they had come was during the Crusades, when for a couple centuries European kingdoms had been established in the Holy Land, surrounded by Middle Eastern Muslim societies. And all things considered, those Muslim societies were rather similar to Europeans. They both lived in cities with kings and nobles. They both had writing and advanced technology. They even shared a religious heritage based on the Hebrew Bible. And even with those similarities, the Crusader kingdoms had had extremely fraught relationships with their neighboring kingdoms. Nevertheless, 16th century Europeans had no other model for dealing with other cultures, so these new lands that were opening up to Europeans were approached in much the same ways, through the lenses of imperialism and colonialism. Imperialism is a practice of extending the rule of a country over foreign nations, usually forcefully, and of taking and holding foreign colonies. Closely related is colonialism, the political, social, economic, and cultural domination of a territory and its people by a foreign power for an extended time. Such domination is usually coercive, though not always. To cut through the complexity here, when Europeans first started to deal with non-European people and places, their only real strategy was to try to make those people and places part of Europe. Colonialism and European empires served their purposes well. By the 19th century, several European nations, especially Britain and France, had secured large empires all around the world. Colonies outside of Europe sent raw materials back to the home countries, which transformed them into finished products, some of which then flowed outward again to be bought by natives in the colonies. Wealth skyrocketed in Europe as more and more money and goods accumulated there. The sometimes brutal subjugation of native cultures during the colonial era was justified by Europeans back home in a variety of ways, but mostly through simple ethnocentrism. Europeans saw their own way of life as self-evidently better than the natives. This was because they judged quality of life primarily according to wealth, and the colonial system ensured Europe would always be wealthier than the colonies. This was coupled with emerging unilinear theories that said all societies, if left to themselves, would eventually come to look like Europeans. Thus, the forced diffusion and assimilation of the colonies was just speeding up a natural process. As British poet Rudyard Kipling put it, the white man's burden was to govern and guide the native until the native came to be like the white man. In exchange, the brown man's burden, so to speak, was to serve the white man in a kind of apprenticeship for civilization. Such was the world system in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. A few European nations as cores, each with worldwide empires of colonies that belonged to the periphery. The rest of Europe was mostly semi-periphery, as were the US and Canada. Things changed very quickly, though, as the next major world development kicked into gear, the Industrial Revolution. Industrialization is a shift in the means of production from primarily human labor to primarily mechanized production. That is, it's the adoption of machines to make most things, rather than making them by hand. And the Industrial Revolution is the major restructuring of European society as it industrialized, beginning about 1750. The Industrial Revolution began in Britain with the invention of a variety of machines to create cloth. For a century, cotton had been one of the biggest crops exported from the American colonies to Britain. There, wealthy importers would distribute bales of raw cotton to housewives, who would hand crank spinning wheels and hand weave it into cloth. They'd then turn the cloth back to the business owners in exchange for a wage. And of course, then the owners would sell the cloth throughout Europe. This was called a cottage industry because production took place in cottages. But as the markets expanded in Europe and the Americas, British spinners and weavers couldn't keep up with demand. The American colonies could produce more cotton than British housewives could weave. Meanwhile, as wealth rose, European consumers would buy up the cloth as quickly as it was made. Smart businessmen invested their wealth in machines that would work better and faster. After some time, any textile company that didn't mechanize couldn't compete. Eventually, the same pressure spread to other industries and then other European nations, resulting in the Industrial Revolution. Our understanding of the social and economic changes that followed industrialization comes largely from those building on the work of Karl Marx. Today, we remember Marx primarily as a political activist and communist, but he was also one of the founders of modern economic and social theory. Writing in the middle and late 19th century, after generations of industrialization, he saw the development of two distinct social classes in Europe, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The bourgeoisie, also called capitalists, owned the factories and machinery that were, by then, used to manufacture almost every conceivable good. They were wealthy and powerful because they controlled the means of production. Nothing got made unless it was made on their terms and benefited them. Below the bourgeoisie was the proletariat, the workers who owned very little except their own labor. The bourgeoisie needed the proletariat to work for them because there weren't enough capitalists to run all the machinery, and the proletariat needed to work for the bourgeoisie to earn a wage, trading their labor for money that could be used to buy goods from the very bourgeoisie who'd paid them in the first place. Marx viewed capitalism as an inherently exploitative process. The proletariat were alienated from their own labor. Its control and value was taken away from them by the bourgeoisie, and they were only paid enough to survive to continue working tomorrow. Marx also believed that the much more numerous proletariat would inevitably rebel against this exploitation, overthrow the domination of the bourgeoisie, and institute a society that lacked private property, because private ownership of capital is what created that exploitation in the first place. Marx was a unilinear evolutionist like most other 19th century scholars. But whereas Lewis Henry Morgan saw societies as passing from savagery to barbarism to civilization, Marx saw them as progressing from capitalism to socialism to communism. Today, Marx's rather simplistic and self-consciously political theories are still influential, but not in their original forms. Later theorists like Max Weber in the early 20th century and later Antonio Gramsci developed Marx's ideas and applied them beyond the strictly economic. Similarly, politicians like Vladimir Lenin and Mao Zedong attempted to apply his theories by adapting them to particular political settings. Without success, it must be noted. But in general, the communist revolutions predicted by Marx never materialized, largely because of the development of an economic class that Marx never predicted, the middle class. The middle class sits in the middle, between the rich and the poor, the owners and the laborers. Over the 19th century, as laborers became more and more vocal in objecting to their exploitation, Marx believed owners would double down in their oppression. Instead, they took a different route, paying a higher wage to create happier, more productive, and loyal workers. This produced a middle class of comfortably wealthy workers who were not owners, but still able to benefit from the capitalist system. They had a vested interest in maintaining the capitalist system, so they didn't rise up in revolt. This worked for much of the last 150 years or so, but your textbook cites a lot of scary statistics to show that the middle class is becoming less and less significant in the global economy. This chart shows that over the last 20 or so years of the 20th century, the amount of wealth controlled by the wealthiest 1% of American society increased, while the amount of wealth controlled by the poorest 80% decreased. This means that those of intermediate wealth, the middle class, is shrinking in size. People who are in the middle class are moving either up or down the economic ladder. Wealth is concentrating more and more in the wealthiest classes, and a larger portion of the population is returning to the working poor category that Marx called the proletariat. The world capitalist economy in the 21st century is shifting back to a pattern more like Marx's day than the days of our parents. Industrialization, for the most part, rendered the old imperial colonial system unnecessary and brought about the modern world system in its current form. The economic relationships between capitalist and laborer meant that production had to be concentrated in the factories and could no longer be performed just anywhere. Thus, there was no reason for European powers to force their colonies to export materials back to the home countries. They'd have to do so voluntarily if they ever wanted to acquire any manufactured goods. Meanwhile, military occupation of colonies was expensive and dangerous, especially when it no longer served a productive purpose. So, early in the 20th century and continuing throughout the middle part of the century, European empires began to break apart, trading political domination for economic integration. This led, ironically, to an even stronger cementing of the core semi-periphery relationships that had been created during colonialism. During the period of the white man's burden, colonial powers had forced on their subjects a variety of fundamentally new social organizations. National boundaries were drawn without regard to the cultural landscape. Languages and customs were outlawed, and enemies were forced into the same communities. These potential problems could be ignored as long as the colonial powers were still present, because the colonizers could simply force people to behave appropriately. Decolonization is the process of a colonial power withdrawing and the colony returning to self-rule. Except many of these native populations had no native tradition of state rule. They had never existed as states before colonization, and during colonization, they'd not been allowed to develop their own state institutions to rival the colonizers. Also, in places where colonial borders crossed traditional ethnic borders, which was most places, The populations of the newly independent nations were often radically unsuitable for peaceful coexistence with one another. This had been a useful strategy during colonial days, as the European powers divided their subject populations against one another. But now that those populations were supposed to get along, borders became a huge problem. Decolonization has been, in many cases, an unmitigated disaster, as much of modern sub-Saharan Africa attests. Post-colonial nations are often culturally diverse, economically poor, and politically tumultuous. Post-colonial nations must shift from a social structure primarily aimed at supporting the colonial power to a structure aimed at supporting and benefiting themselves. In the short term, this often means doubling down on their periphery economic relationships, exporting more and more resources to core countries to purchase more and more imported goods. That strategy can pump up the superficial standard of living temporarily, but it ultimately leads to ecocide, ecological destruction through non-sustainable extraction of natural resources. Meanwhile, ethnic groups forced together under colonialism are all attempting to position themselves as the new ruling class because political power can be converted to economic wealth. The political conflicts that result are often disruptive even for a temporary increase in the standard of living. In general, we can say that most nations in the world today aspire to either achieve or maintain a core status. To that end, every nation wants to develop economically to the point where it's able to produce most of its own goods for consumption. Your textbook has an excellent discussion of development strategies and neoliberalism, the strategy most often used in the global system today. I won't cover it here, but of course you're responsible for that information on the exam.